I think we're going to start, if we may. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Minister Patel. Thank you very much for joining this webinar on localization. My name is Martin Kingston. I'm the Vice President of Business Unity South Africa and the Chair of the Steering Committee of Business for South Africa. Very appreciative of the fact that Minister Patel, Harold Harvey, Eustace Mashimbi, Stavros Nicolaou are both here and all prepared to speak as panelists, as well as the participants. I know there are still more that are joining us as we speak. I'd like to also thank the Localization Technical Working Committee for having arranged this session. That working committee was established in the wake of the 2018 Job Summit Agreement to raise awareness of localization possibilities and to promote local procurement wherever possible by South African business. And the technical committee consists of senior representatives from Business Unity South Africa, Business Leadership South Africa, the Manufacturing Circle, the National Business Initiative, and Proudly South Africa. The Technical Working Committee has redoubled its efforts to enhance private sector localization following the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan that was announced by President Ramaphosa, which includes various localization interventions to grow the domestic market, boost demand for local products, and create much needed growth and employment. As business, and specifically as Business for South Africa, we participated in the negotiations and engagements at NEDLAC and are fully supportive of this process, and we're committed to ensuring that business can play its part in generating meaningful and measurable outcomes. Today's session serves as a means to familiarize a broad spectrum of the business community with government and organized businesses thinking around localization, providing an overview of recent successes and benefits, as well as some of the supporting tools available to businesses to source local supplies and identify opportunities for import replacement wherever viable and practical. The key objective of today's session will be to provide a basis for subsequent follow-up engagements, both at a sectoral as well as a company level with the DTIC and the Technical Working Committee, and to begin work or to carry on the work that's already started on identifying products for localization and import replacement, and securing commitments from the private sector, specifically with respect to identified products and targets, both in a product and sectoral sense, in this regard. Minister, thank you very much for joining us. If I can now hand over to you.
Well, let me start first, Martin, by thanking you and giving a very warm good afternoon to all of the representatives from firms and enterprises that have joined us, the CEOs, the representatives of organized business. I appreciate the time you're taking, and I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to make some remarks here. I want to confine my remarks in, I would say, three broad areas. The first is to talk about why localization, to briefly reflect on an important consensus that government and the business community has forged at NEDLAC, and then perhaps finally to share some ideas and an approach on how we can practically approach the localization challenge. And I start with saying that the importance of localization should be the starting point, because I want to suggest that though it comes with difficulties and challenges, though it is something that requires enormous effort, it also has huge benefits to the economy as a whole and to ultimately to individual businesses beyond the transition costs and challenges as we ramp up greater levels of localization. Consider, for example, that South Africa spends about 25% of its wealth on importing products from elsewhere in the world. Now, some of those products are not available locally, and others are not likely to be available on commercially feasible basis for the foreseeable future. But if we exclude crude oil, we import about 1.1 trillion rands worth of goods per year. Many of those products can be produced locally. And if we can cross the hurdles, the sourcing locally come with enormous economic multipliers. If you just consider that the Industrial Development Corporation tells me that manufacturing has the highest GDP multiplier of all sectors of the economy. For every 1 rand of output created in manufacturing, another 3 rand is created in related sectors of the economy. Or to put it more concretely, for every job that's created in manufacturing, 4 other jobs are sustained elsewhere in the economy. So if we want the South African economy to grow, we need to support local manufacturing. Now, of course, that's, if you like, the generic argument for it that would apply pretty much at all times. The particular moment we confront is one of significant shock to the economy as a result of the pandemic and the measures that we took in South Africa, but that our trading partners took across the world, that has hit industry, both on the export markets with a dramatic decrease in demand for certain critical goods, but also here in the domestic market with lower volumes. And in these circumstances, the president convened the leadership of the business community and the unions and a range of community representatives, together with the government team, to say, how can we reignite growth in the economy, have economic recovery as the central point, now that we have made some progress in flattening the curve, in getting ready to manage the infection rates, and now refocusing our thinking and our attention, Martin and colleagues, to economic reconstruction. And the package that was finalized as a result of engagement by negotiators from all sides looked at increased infrastructure development, because that has a huge economic multiplier, reforms in network industries like energy, transport, and digital industries, localization, it was a major area identified, recovery measures for tourism, stabilization of the mining sector, employment support, particularly public support for bringing young people into employment opportunities, albeit for a short period, dealing with crime and corruption, both of which not only takes resources out of the economy, but saps confidence, building a capable state. And we agreed we would jointly mobilize human and financial resources. And one of these areas, the one that particularly brings us together, is the focus on localization. And what the NEDLAC parties agreed is that we would work together to reduce the proportion of imported, intermediate, and finished goods, that we would seek to improve the efficiency of local producers and develop export competitive sectors. The specific commitment that was made by all of the parties, that we said, when we looked at it, we were all convinced that this was necessary, is that we must implement measurable and significant increases by volume and value in both the public sector and the private sector procurement from local manufacturers. And we identified about 6 or so broad value chains. We then said in the agreement or the accord that we will establish targets to improve on current levels of localization in value chains. And we then announced 2 sets of deadlines, essentially culminating by the end of November with targets to be set for various sectors. Now, because I'm not sure if all the participants have equal sight of the documentation, I'm going to just briefly tell you this, what the 6 value chains are. The first one is agro-processing, and it includes things like poultry and sugar, oils, grains, juice concentrates, and dairy products. So these would both be inputs into food industries as well as finished products for consumers. There was a healthcare value chain covering pharmaceuticals, PPEs, and medical equipment, basic consumer goods, and it's a wide range from clothing and footwear to home textiles, consumer electronic products and appliances, together with household hardware, packaging material, and furniture. We identified capital goods. You can imagine what they are. They're essentially the inputs into mining, agriculture, the green economy, and digital infrastructure. Construction-driven value chain was the fifth one, and there it covered products like cement, steel, piping, engineering products, and earth-moving equipment. And finally, it was transport rolling stock, covering both cars, trucks on the one end, and rail assembly. So that was broadly what was the agreement. These were complemented by a few other provisions, one calling on supplier development programs at sector and large firm level, another committing government to cracking down on illegal imports, a third one getting all the NEDLAC parties, so these would be your community groups and organized business and the unions and government, promoting a buy local campaign, particularly over this Christmas period. And finally, a reporting requirement or commitment that we all said we will ensure that our enterprises in the private sector and in the public sector can report the extent to which they are currently sourcing locally and what steps they think they can take in future to deepen it further. Of course, it's a partnership. It means everybody must bring something. There's a range of things government can do. We can take care of things in our own domain, what we buy. And so we've got regulations now covering the kind of things that government buys and an increasing number of that. There's now a mandatory requirement that they be localized. There are incentives that we've had in place and industry partnership agreements, for example, in poultry and sugar. There are these ones in sugar, for example. Harold Harvey, who's in the meeting, has pulled together the sugar producers, the farmers and millers on the one end, the big beverage makers and the food companies, as well as the retailers. And they've agreed to some numbers. They've said, look, we've done a baseline. We're at X. We're going to move to 80% by 2021, and we'll move to 95% 3 years within a 3-year frame. There's things we can do on customs enforcement, obviously, as government, and there's plenty that we have done. And there's also things we can do on customs duties to where there's policy space to adjust tariffs. Sometimes tariffs need to be reduced. For example, tariffs on fabric so that the input costs are cheaper. Sometimes they need to be increased, particularly on finished goods, to give local manufacturers a degree of support while they undertake the restructuring that's necessary. And of course, the big story is investment. And on Wednesday, the president is convening the 3rd edition of the investment conference. But I've particularly been pleased that I have had an opportunity through the meeting that Busa has convened today to talk to the private sector. So I don't want to talk principally about what government can do. It's really how we can get some more traction in the partnership between government and the business community. Of course, we also have to work with trade unions and with the other partners in NEDLAC. But the principal drivers, and I think everybody's in agreement with this, will be the procurement by individual firms and the procurement by government entities. And so how do we put a practical plan together? I am reluctant for us to kick this into the long grass of task teams and all the bureaucracy that comes with this. We need a target we can chase, some number that we say, that's what we're going to put our best efforts in, really stretch what we can do. We need to identify products. We must say, here's a working list of products that we're going to seek to localize. And then in my view, the best thing is to give businesses, firms, the freedom to use their flexibility, their drive, their energy to get on with the job. And then have a simple and very crisp reporting arrangement where we can see on aggregate, how are we doing? Are we shifting the needle materially to where we want it to go? So I start off with the fact that for me, the big number is 1.1 trillion rand. That's the value of non-oil imports that South Africa does, or at least did in 2019. And the question is, how much of that can be localized? So if we aim, say, for 20% localization of that import number, and we say, let's give ourselves a number of years, let's, by way of illustration, say a 5-year period, then it would mean we would need to generate sourcing in South Africa of the order of 220 billion rand a year in current prices to be able to achieve this. Sorry, not per year, 220 billion rand over the 5-year period to achieve this. And that comes to about, call it 45 billion rand a year, again in current prices. Now, if that's the kind of order of magnitude that we need to work on, it's bold. It says over a 5-year period, we would have materially shifted the quantum and the proportion of goods that we source from South African companies or companies based in South Africa, whether they are locally owned or foreign owned, but they have operations, manufacturing operations, and they've got farms here in South Africa. And so what I would want to do is to say that, practically speaking, we need that kind of big galvanizing number that says that's where we want to go. Of the 1.1 trillion rand, if we want to do 20% of it, that's 220 billion rand. And on an annual basis, it's approximately 45 billion rand a year. Now that covers the first area, which is to set a target that is the big picture target. Then we need products. Now we have the advantage that a number of products are identified for illustrative purposes in the NEDLAC agreement. And there are a few others that have come out in the dialogues that we've had with different sectors or the master plans that have been put in place. I've met with the CEOs of hardware stores as well as the CEOs of the fast food retailers. We've had discussions with the big grocery stores, the big supermarkets, with a range of other players in construction, in the large manufacturers in the economy, PPE users. So these are places like hospitals and so on, as well as producers, and a range of other ones. And I think identifying an initial list is actually quite easy. They would obviously include things like edible oils. I mean, we currently import about 8 billion rands worth of edible oils, of which about half of that would be palm oils. And there's a commitment, an increasing realization that we should be shifting away from palm oils to various seed and other oils, which provide opportunities here in South Africa for growing, for processing, and for including in our foodstuffs. Poultry is an obvious and easy area. Sugar already has a very clear 3-year step-up commitment. Fruit juices and concentrates have been identified in meetings that I've had with the business community. Clothing, textiles, and leather products like shoes and others. There's already a framework, and we're now working to bed down specific annual targets. On PPEs, already there's been a fair bit of success. We were at about 6 million units of these N95 masks that healthcare workers use. At the start of the pandemic, we now have the capability to produce 13 million masks. And 8 months ago, we were importers of CPAP ventilators. Today, through the efforts of the National Ventilator Project, we've produced 20,000 of these ventilators that can be used in our healthcare system. There are also steel products, a range of steel products. I can take you through many of them if needs be: cement and antiretrovirals, other pharmaceutical products. I was delighted when Aspen could be nominated by Johnson & Johnson to be the producer of vaccines that they expect to be approved imminently. Companies like PepsiCo and others have agreed during competition proceedings to quite significant localization. We can take some of those products and see if we can get industry buy-in to strengthen the efforts that the global companies will do. There are dairy products, grains, furniture, household hardware, fridges and stoves. We've got producers now in South Africa. Equipment used in infrastructure, that's a big one, and consumer electronics. Now, not everything is produced in quantity locally, and it's a matter of focusing on the ones where we can get the biggest immediate traction by the efforts that we put in. And of course, scale can give enormous advantage. As we have greater levels of localization, and scale of production goes up, it can assist to bring unit prices down. Of course, quality must be of a high standard and fit for purpose, and flexibility of supply and reliability would be critical selling points for local industry as we forge this important and somewhat unusual partnership with end users in the form of retailers and food producers, and the producers of the products that we seek to localize. So, Martin, in summary, there's a compelling economic argument for localization. That argument has been amplified and underlined as a result of the challenges the economy faces as a result of the pandemic, and the need to get more traction to lift aggregate demand in the economy. There are a lot of goodwill in the business community and in other social partners, and all of that goodwill resulted in a significant agreement at NEDLAC that we all now need to really partner. And I've shared with you some of the details of that agreement. Fundamentally, to get moving, what you do as businesses, you set a target. We think that's sensible in this case. And we think we should set an aggregate target based on the 1.1 trillion rand of non-oil imports into the economy, something of the order of 20% of that target over a reasonable period, let's say a 5-year period, break it down into an annual target, identify a list of products based on the NEDLAC discussions and the value chains that were identified there, and then get CEOs of firms to drive this, to champion this. I don't want to create too many clumsy structures with lots of government officials and all of your energy goes into task teams. So we need to find fit for purpose forums. If there needs to be a quick network to pull together everybody, we do so. If there are challenges that you feel need to have some degree of sight and support by the state, please do so. But if the CEO of McDonald's South Africa puts up his hand and he says, I'd like to take the edible oils, and I'd like to really work with my colleagues and see how can we bring down the level of imports, and we're going to work towards the overall target. We think we can do more than 20%. We think we could maybe do 30% or 40% localization of that number that we currently import. Another, perhaps one of the hardware store CEOs says, I'll put up my hand and work with my colleagues on localizing all cement procurement. I think that's the kind of thing that we do. And we take the same drive and energy and enterprise that you use in running your businesses, and we bring it to bear on something that makes good socioeconomic sense, makes fantastic economic sense in the sense of the impact on the aggregates in the economy, but fundamentally makes good long-term business sense for pretty much most businesses in the South African economy. Even if you're not immediately the beneficiary, the increase in aggregate demand and the recovery of the economy, and with that, the virtuous cycle of increased investment and increased confidence will benefit everybody. It's really the tide that they say lifts all boats. So I really would want us to talk about the how and keep it really simple, avoid bureaucracy, have some numbers. And these are not numbers that any firm will be taken to court to say, well, you know, this is the contract you haven't yielded. It's a socioeconomic agreement. It's an accord. It's something that we're going to put everything in. Where we stumble, we're going to come back to each other and say, we're stumbling here for this reason. And where we succeed, we're going to go out to the South African public and celebrate those successes. And that's really the spirit in which I want us to do this, because we could spend 6 months trying to do all sorts of sector studies and product studies and so on, and spend so much energy on putting on paper what the work is. And I just prefer, you know, loosen the tie, roll up the sleeves, get going, see where we can succeed. Not everything is going to come right. We meet many obstacles, and there must be an openness and a problem-solving mindset that we all have on how we can help each other and help the South African economy to recover. Martin, with those words, I'd really like to hand back to you and to appreciate the opportunity for these opening remarks.
Minister Patel, thank you very much indeed for those opening remarks. You've certainly given us much to think about and targets to focus on. If I can suggest that we take all the questions after our panel members have spoken after you, and invite Harold Harvey to talk on the local manufacturing partnership and benefits of localization to the economy and the private sector. Harold?
Thank you, Martin. I'm struggling to get my camera on, so please forgive me for that. I want to focus just very quickly, as you requested, just to talk through a case study of what we did on the local manufacturing partnership. It really just talks to the how one goes about delivering what Minister Patel has just sort of laid out as an approach, which is very pragmatic, very kind of roll up on sleeves. And I think, you know, to try and keep it very crisp, back in March, 8-9 months ago, as the COVID-19 pandemic was barreling down on us, Minister Patel very quickly mobilized a bunch of resources in the department to say, look, we can see what's happening globally. PPE supplies are becoming very, very constrained as the whole world was facing similar things. And countries with more buying power than us were buying up with the stocks, and prices were skyrocketing. And what can we do to locally manufacture or bring on stream local manufacturing capacity very quickly, both for PPE and medical devices, particularly the CPAP ventilators that the minister spoke about. And I think, you know, if we reflect back now, I mean, the minister spoke about a manufacturing capacity for the FFP2 respirator masks. We had a manufacturing capacity of between 4 and 6 million coming into the pandemic. Those were all being produced locally, mainly for the mining industry. They were not licensed or rated for use in healthcare settings. And if I look back now, where we got to is that 13 million a month manufacturing capacity is being done by companies that are fully licensed, and it makes us effectively, you know, a second wave, allowing self-reliant in our ability to supply that. In other categories like gowns and other parts of, with one or two small exceptions, we went from a place where we had no local industry at all to speak of that was manufacturing that form of PPE. And today we are very close to self-reliance. And I'll speak a little bit about the one or two places where we haven't, because there's interesting learnings there. And how did it happen? Well, it really happened by starting out doing a very rapid piece of work to say, what is the supply requirement here, or the demand requirement here? Very quickly, I reached agreement with Department of Health, private hospital groups as to the kinds of volumes that were required. Thankfully, out of the crisis, the Solidarity Fund had been mobilized. We had the Motsepe Foundation, NASPERS, the Spire Fund from the First Rand Group come piling in with resources that allowed us to secure the offtake commitments. And we spent, mobilized the team to go and look at where the potential sources of supply are going to be, who can manufacture, what are the bottlenecks, and adopt that very problem-solving approach that the minister spoke to. The key in this thing was being able to put mechanisms in place, a platform in place that was made up of DTIC officials. It was made up of an army of private sector specialist resources, and a bunch of resources that were also deployed from organized labor with deep technical knowledge or specialist knowledge in certain areas. We organized them into work teams and we off to the races. And, we were running with dashboards. So we had a number to chase. We had a capacity that we had to bring on stream. And each work stream was working hand in glove with local manufacturers that had existing or relevant capabilities to start producing these things. And so, if I could steal a little bit from Gladwell's Tipping Point book, we had a mechanism in place made up of people who were great connectors, ability to pick up phones, talk to anybody in the country whose help we needed or who needed to help us get a door kicked down, to go in and have a conversation, to find sources of funding. We had a team of mavens, so the technical experts, the subject matter experts, the industry experts who could help us understand very quickly where's the source of supply, what is the raw material problem we have to solve for, where is the technical or skill capability gap we have to address. And then, we had that goodwill, and we had this great network of champions out there being the salespeople, helping us bring people onto the platform with resources, or come in and help us source companies that could do things. And that team has been working now effectively for just over 6 months, where today we have got 54 companies fully on stream, fully licensed with SAPRA, able to produce and manufacture effectively, as I said, with two small exceptions, the entire needs of the healthcare system in South Africa. The two exceptions are instructive, because what we've learned in this process is that if you're trying to localize in a category where you've got existing or relevant capabilities, so it's an adjacency to an existing area of strength of manufacturing, you can get moving incredibly quickly. It's in the spaces where there's a whole new set of investments that have to be made that things take a little bit more time. So if we look at, for example, latex or examination gloves and surgical gloves, we're still struggling there. We've still got some manufacturing capacity from an previously existing manufacturer, but it's a new ball game. It requires different types of capital equipment, specialized skills. There's some issues with the global supply chains on the nitrile in raw material input. And so we're learning that part of the secret sauce here is being able to sequence the interventions into places where you're playing to your strengths and you start there. I think we've learned a couple of very, useful things that, and I'm sure, this is preaching to the converted when you talk to the manufacturers on this platform, on this call. But for the off-takers, because having the commitment to the off-take, is the golden key that enables you to unlock a whole lot of other, pull a whole lot of other levers through the value chain. And the issue there, obviously, is you're up against, established sourcing organizations that have got, supplier partnerships in other parts of the world that they've been living with for a long time. There's security of supply, or they're at least comfort with the quality of those relationships that they've developed over time. But I think what we've seen, if I go back and I look at how mask manufacturers at the beginning of the pandemic were struggling to come in at prices at the maximum that had been set by National Treasury, today we can beat the price of Chinese manufactured imported masks by 2 to 3 rand per mask. That is the value of the scale. That is what having that the demand side commitments has unlocked for us. The second issue is what we're now finding as we talk to the customers of the demand side of the supply chain, is that they've learned a whole lot about the value of shortened supply chains, about being able to do smaller orders and shorter order lead times compared to ordering 9 months in advance, millions and millions and millions of units out of China. The working capital that's being unlocked in their businesses is immense. Now, of course, the challenge always as we thread these kinds of compacts together is that for manufacturers, having small order quantities on shorter order lead times has an adverse impact on their balance sheets. But we've found ways of very innovatively being able to structure offtake commitments and then translate them into the way that they're executed that deliver the kind of benefits to the off-takers that I was talking about, but that we can give certainty of offtake enough to generate the kind of commitments that a manufacturer needs in order to go and raise debt or to make the investments that they need. The last point I want to make is that the value in the partnership was the diversity of the capabilities that are being brought in. Often there's a perception that when you've got organized labor in your partnership, for example, that, all they're bringing is people who sit in the meetings. I can tell you that in 2 or 3 of the PPE categories, if it hadn't been for the deep, deep sector knowledge and the high quality relationships that some of the unions had with manufacturers, we would not have got this far. They delivered. They were central to unlocking our ability in a number of different important value chains. But it's a tough job, right? Because we're not skilled at working in these compact things. I think South Africa's got more of a history of doing this in most countries. But there was a lot of relearning that needed to happen. A lot of the people involved were young. The feedback we're getting from the young engineers, from the various companies that have deployed these engineers to work in our teams, is that they've come out having learned so much about how to get stuff done through collaborative ways of working. Is fundamentally different from what they used to when they have to sort of build a refinery. So I think what we've got in this local manufacturing partnership is a case study and a prototype that has been tested. It's something that I think the overall localization program can look at and learn and draw lessons from. But we've also, I think, given the wide degree of participation from across the business sort of sector that was involved in delivering on this program, you've got a whole generation of people now who've kind of earned their school fees, they've learned the lessons, and they're kind of ready and deployable to help us accelerate on the bigger program as part of the recovery program. Thanks very much, Martin.
Thank you, Harold. And I think it's been a phenomenal journey, and we've obviously participated alongside you and Labour in the structures that were established and are still ongoing. And I think we need to see how we can integrate them into the work that the Minister is talking about going forwards. If I can then hand over to Eustace and Stavros. Before I do so, can I suggest, I see some people have already started to put some questions in the chat box. We should probably carry on doing that to the extent that we don't have enough time with raised hands afterwards. We can do both. Thank you very much. Eustace, can I please hand over to you?
Thank you very much, Martin. Good afternoon, Minister, and good afternoon to all the colleagues on the line, captains of industry, who've agreed to share their time with us and spend the afternoon with us whilst we take you through what we have been working on as the Localization Technical Working Committee. So just by way of background, and which you've touched on a bit Martin. We are responding through this exercise to what started in 2018 when the president hosted the Jobs Summit, and a few commitments were then tabled at the Job Summit. But what was contained in the presidential Job Summit framework agreement at the time included localization commitments from all social partners. And so business also made a few commitments. And in response to that, we then formed this local procurement technical working committee, or localization technical working committee. And a few advocates came from a few institutions that started working on this. And this includes, like you said at the beginning, Martin, Proudly SA, BUSA, BLSA, NBI, Manufacturing Circle, as well as SAB, offering secretariat services and now chairing the technical working committee to help us start progressing on achieving those objectives. But what came up, and the minister touched on this, was that COVID came, and as a response to COVID, there was a need to then, in response to the state of the economy even before COVID and how the economy was during COVID, was to come up with an economic recovery plan, and which came with other localization commitments coming from all social partners. And so in order to assist the private sector, the Localization Committee then drafted a letter that went out to all members of the apex body BUSA, as well as all its partner industry bodies and all affiliates, in order to ensure that they then disseminate that information to the individual corporates. Because if you refer to the minister's example, the work will happen on the ground with the actual corporates themselves. And so the request to the industry bodies was for them to call on the corporates to make these 4 commitments that you see on the screen. And the first one was for them to review their procurement practices and to give preference in all cases where it's possible to companies that make their products locally, and to make procurement commitments to give preference through the entire supply chain to local producers as best as possible, and to start making procurement opportunities. And we welcome the suggestion being made by the minister to then take that to actual products themselves, where actual companies, where actual industries at industry level, we can even get commitments for opportunities to start being ring-fenced for localization and for products to be identified that can form part of this localization drive. And we, as a technical working committee, then came up with this procurement portal. And what we're calling for is for the utilization of this procurement portal, because it seeks to give effect to the commitments that will have been made by the individual entities, by the industry bodies on behalf of those companies that are part of their industries, to help them drive their localization objective, but also to support the transformation objective. And so the portal is called Market Access Platform, and that's my responsibility today, to introduce you to this portal, which basically seeks to ensure that corporate members who are going to give us commitments can then use that portal to find suppliers, local producers that can then become their preferred companies that they can buy from as soon as they make localization commitments. And just to give you a quick sense of how it works, so we will have a database of companies that will have been vetted for quality and local content. And each of these companies will then give us localization commitments, and the commitments can be in the form of specific products or a broad range of items that they will commit to buy local. So self-designation, in the same way that the public sector is designated, we're calling on the private sector to self-designate. And so those items that are identified for localization will then be ring-fenced. And every time the procurement opportunities arise, they will get a preference when purchasing decisions are made for buying those items. The next step will then be to identify suitable companies that are making the products locally, not people who are going to be intermediaries and will bring in products from outside, and as an example, change labels, etc., and then to sell them onwards to the private sector as if they were locally made. So the idea is that we should find a database of companies on the Proudly SA database, working with the industry bodies themselves. The DTIC has sector desks which will assist us in this regard as soon as the items are identified by each respective industry body or corporate. The corporates and their buyers themselves will then register on MAP. And as a corporate buyer, you will then be able to go into the platform, do a search, and find a company that you can buy from. And this will include the opportunity for those corporates who will have given us the local procurement commitments to advertise the tenders. So within that closed community of entities that will be working together on MAP, there will be opportunities, tenders or procurement opportunities that will be advertised. This will enable both the buyers and suppliers to transact. And what we are going to focus on as a technical working committee on localization is to start tracking that spend. So there will be monitoring that takes place in order for us to be able to report on the dashboard the procurement spend for those items, what each corporate has spent on there, and what the impact has been in terms of contribution to the GDP collectively once we look at the globular figures, what the contribution has been or will be to the retention of jobs, as well as the creation of much needed new jobs. So that dashboard is what we will then use to start reporting on whether there is progress being made or not for all that spend. And so I would like to ask that the technical guys play for you a video. It's a short video, 2-minute video, which demonstrates to you how the system works, because that's the purpose of my introduction or the purpose of my presentation. And afterwards, I'll then come back to wrap up quickly within the allocated time slot before I bring back Stavros. Thank you, Chair. Technical? I think we need sound, guys. Apologies for this, Martin. We need sound, guys. Okay, apologies for that. We seem to be battling with the sound, but what we wanted to demonstrate through this video is how buyers would be able to register themselves and be able to then find companies that they can buy from. So it's a pity we're battling with the sound. But that is what we have made available, is to enable corporates who are going to give us those localization commitments to be able to find suppliers, and so that we can then track those localization commitments. And I'd like to ask that maybe Stavros come in at this time to then finish off this slot that we have been allocated, and then we can give it back to you, Martin. But after Stavros speaks, I would like them to play an ad. I mean, one of the commitments that has been made by the social partners in the economic recovery plan is to roll out campaigns, including the festive season campaign during this time, to ensure that we mobilize society as a whole to buy locally made products. And so after Stavros speaks, I ask that we kindly be given 30 seconds to play the ad that underpins that campaign, which we are going to roll out with various social partners, with various entities. And some of it will be sector specific, but this will be the generic campaign that will talk to every single South African to try and get them to choose locally made products to help us rebuild the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eustace. And maybe they can get the sound on in the meanwhile and put it back up if there's time. Stavros?
Thank you.
Eustace, thanks very much. Martin, good afternoon. Minister, good afternoon to you and all the other colleagues that have joined this webinar. I'm going to, in my 3-minute slot, reinforce and to an extent endorse and complement what Eustace and other speakers have presented here today. And because the focus is very much around medical equipment and medically related products, I think it's worth repeating a statistic I think that is becoming rather well known at the moment, and that is that between pharma and medical equipment, they represent the 5th largest contributor to our country's current account deficit. Now, when you place it in perspective, in that we have probably, we're in the top 5 in terms of disproportionate disease burdens of any country. And if we're importing to that extent, it certainly doesn't make sense. I can tell you that the import to overall industry value in pharma is 65%, and it's closer to 90% for medical equipment. Clearly unacceptable statistic, and one that I think is deserving of all the focus and attention we're placing on it today. I'd like to get a little more practical in terms of how the private sector, Business for South Africa, and other business formations are looking to support and complement this initiative. The starting point for us is that the market has a clearly defined private and then a public sector. And the levers and interventions that we use are a little different depending on which of the two sectors you're considering. But there's one common denominator here, and that's that trade deficit I spoke about. And the obvious place to start, and this is something that Minister Patel mentioned, it's something that proudly South Africa has been looking at for some time. We need to take the list of the top 100 imported medical equipment and pharma products and work our way systematically down that list. Some of these products are immediately producible in this country and capacity exists already. Some of those we can get to within the next 3-year time frame. And then there's an outlier group where we probably won't be able to make these products at all. This might include things like biologics, and that would be a much longer term project. Identifying these products and then measuring and quantifying this on an annual basis to understand whether targets have been met or not is critical. This has been lacking previously. And it's certainly heartening, Minister Patel, when your department phones and says, look, you're sitting with a 35 billion rand trade deficit. How much of that can we close in the immediacy? And that's the type of target-driven approach and measurement that we need to institute in the sector, but we also more broadly need the South African public and society at large to start buying into. We might want to, even at a point in time, develop a barometer that we put on billboards and otherwise to get that public sentiment clearly aimed and directed at understanding the need to localize. I mentioned that there were different levers and instruments that we could potentially use, both looking at international best practice and also looking at our own country's idiosyncrasies. And I'd like to just in closing mention two of these. Let me mention the public sector first. And I should add that the public sector constitutes most of the volume in pharma and medical equipment, but it constitutes a much lower value. So in essence, most of the value lies in the private sector. And that is the thrust of today's messaging, I believe. How do we get the private sector involved around a localization campaign, and how do we get them to buy in? So let me quickly mention an intervention in the public sector, and then I'll end off with the private sector. In the public sector, certainly in our discussions in NEDLAC, we've proposed a 3-point plan. It's a simple 3-point plan. The first is that we need to identify existing manufacturers and capacity and SMEs that want to get into the space and look at long-term offtakes rather than the boom-bust tendering process that you see at the moment. Of course, this needs to be done on a long-term basis, understanding that there can't be rent-seeking. We believe that if we get that lever right and we successfully implement it, that will make a world of difference to both localization and also diminishing the trade deficit that continues to disfigure this sector. Also in the public sector, we believe that there should be expedited registration for those products that are produced locally as a way to retaining investors and also attracting new investors into the sector. And lastly, we need to once and for all properly implement designation. It's guaranteed offtakes I spoke about earlier, but it's something that we've been unsuccessful in implementing in the last 9 or 10 years. So those are the public sector interventions we'd like to see. In the private sector, let me end off with that. The private sector, up until present, largely takes decisions on what is the best margin decision for businesses, understandably so. There's shareholders that invest in these businesses and they expect a return. The feeling there is that we need to appeal rationally and logically on the back to the private sector. And the private sector is really your hospital groups, your funders. These are your medical scheme administrators. So your corporate chains like a Dis-Chem, a Clicks, etc. The appeal's got to be on the basis of if we're able to fully exercise and realize the multiplier effect back into the economy, as Minister Patel articulated it, there will be so many more people that we can employ that will then become customers of both the funders and or the corporate chains. And in fact, a study that the IDC did about 6 or 7 years ago demonstrated that for every R1 spent in the public sector in procurement, we would add 32 cents back into the fiscus were we to support a locally produced product as opposed to an import. The same rationale and logic would prevail in the private sector. So our key challenge here is to get the private sector buyers, the purchasers, if I can call them that, to enter into long-term agreements with local producers on the same basis as I've described it in the private sector. Because it not only does it make sense fiscally speaking, but also we can get the same type of margins if we get economies of scale that they are currently enjoying for importers. So those are just our couple of interventions that we've proposed. We've dialed this back into the Proudly South Africa initiatives, the various initiatives they're driving. And the next step is we will be convening through the BUSA Health Working Forum, a meeting with the buyers of the various funders, hospitals, providers, and corporates, so that we can take this to the next practical step. Thanks very much, Martin.
Thank you very much, Stavros. And Eustace, if I can then hand back to you, I think your video is now working again.
Yes, thank you, Martin. So I asked that the technical guys play first the video that seeks to explain, give a sense of what the MAP is about, what this market access platform is about, and afterwards we'll then play the festive season campaign, or the generic campaign that will underpin the festive season campaign, and then I'll hand over back to you. Thanks, Martin. Guys, please, technical.
Large companies operating in South Africa recognize the long-term strategic benefit of current legislation focusing on transformation and corporates' responsibility to localize supply chains beyond philanthropic reasons and to comply with the legislation. Corporates are increasingly investing in enterprise and supply development initiatives. However, a number of challenges remain. Finding vetted manufacturers according to local content requirements at acceptable industry standard levels of quality with the capacity to keep up with demands required from large organizations. Finding high-performing, transformed suppliers across all categories, bridging the gap between buyers' expectations and suppliers' capabilities, and suppliers' over-reliance on limited key accounts. Searching for suppliers is a key step in the procurement process. The suppliers need to meet the company's expectations regarding cost, capacity, quality, deadline, as well as performance. Introducing Market Access Platform, your preferred portal to source localized and transformed supplies. Market Access Platform, MAP, is an online portal that influences localization and transformation. It enables corporates to refer, find, and rate vetted high-performing transformed suppliers, local service providers, and manufacturers across industries, thereby creating market access for suppliers while mitigating the risks associated with sourcing from unfamiliar companies. Buyers are able to find reliable and vetted localized and transformed suppliers, refer their high-performing transformed suppliers, local manufacturers, and service providers to MAP, thereby enabling them to grow and become more competitive. Advertise procurement opportunities. support the growth of their own high-performing suppliers, increase competitiveness in sourcing, reduce the cost of sourcing, rate services received from suppliers, view the socio-economic impact of their commercial activity with selected suppliers, and record and monitor their localization procurement commitments. Suppliers are able to increase their visibility in a cross-industry marketplace, find other suppliers to procure from, and view tenders when published. Benefits and unique selling proposition. Buyer benefits. Contribute towards a localized and transformed supply chain. Retain and create jobs. Enable the sustainability of suppliers by creating market access opportunities. And contribute to the growth of the economy by favoring local manufacturers and service providers by increasing local demand. Supplier benefits. Corporate visibility. Gauge client satisfaction. B2B opportunities. Buying from other suppliers. And attend proudly South African events and be exposed to the collective National Buy Local campaign, calling on both private and public sectors, as well as consumers, to procure locally. We are therefore calling on corporate South Africa to review and secure procurement practices and give preference in all cases possible to companies that are manufacturing locally. Utilize MAP to influence localization and transformation. Refer and find high-performing suppliers. Advertise procurement opportunities, and record and monitor localization procurement commitments. Market Access Platform, your preferred portal to source localized and transformed suppliers.
Thank you. So that's the video. For those companies that wish to already list themselves or make contact with us, we've worked with SAP or AB InBev, and we're grateful for them. They came up with this platform. We've adopted it as the localization technical working committee as a tool that we are going to use going forward. So for those that are interested, you can write to us, info@proudlysa.co.za. We will then assist you with registering on MAP, info@proudlysa.co.za. And as I conclude, I ask that we spend the next 30 seconds going through the generic campaign that will be rolled out during the festive season. And then I'll hand back to you, Martin. Thank you.
The second half is about to begin. We need to change the scoreboard. It's time for all of us to pause and rethink the game plan in order to save the future. I call on all of us to be game changers because greatness isn't reserved only for some people. By buying local, we're choosing to create jobs and sustain the ones we have. Time and time again, South Africans have taken destiny into their own hands, creating products that the rest of the world wanted to buy. See, the world remembers about us, what we sometimes forget, but it's time for change. Let's all buy local. It's game time. Zanzi.
Local is lekker.
Your everyday decisions shape our future.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Eustace, and thank you, staff. And if I can then suggest that we move immediately to questions, and if people want to put their hands up to either ask questions or make brief comments. I see that we have Minister Harold, Eustace, Stav, a number of questions that have been put in the chat box. Maybe while people are wondering whether they want to put up their hands or not, Minister, I can just summarize some of them, and you can answer as you see fit. There's one which is more of a comment than a question about the need to embrace productivity, and I think that goes hand in glove with the fact that we've said wherever practical and viable that we should localize. There's a question about companies in the textile industry seeking grants from organizations such as the DTI and waiting an extended period of time with approvals in place, but unable to access the funds. Maybe we can identify in this call some points of contact so that people can then follow up accordingly. The time frame for working with the private sector you've already talked about, Minister, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more with you in the time that is available. Anand Singh has asked about creating greater certainty around film incentives, as that's a low-hanging fruit for job creation, tourism, and global revenue. There's a question from the CEO of Saint-Gobain Africa, committed to localization and reindustrialization, talking about support at 3 levels: priority at the state level, state, SOE, municipalities, advertising that, of course, we've talked about in the context inter alia of Proudly SA, and the facilitation of exports. I presume we're including in particular there to the AFCTFA. If you could elaborate on those 3 points. And then some questions about the process going forwards, which I'd like us to wrap up with. And then one question for you, Eustace, about registration on the MAP platform. But I think that to some degree, your video already addressed that. If we can start with those, Minister, I don't see any hands up yet, and then we'll go to the next batch.
Thank you very much, Martin. So let me start with first the issue that was raised by somebody around ensuring that a localization drive must have a market-based framework and perspective. And I think that there's certainly it's right. I mean, ultimately, what this program is about is to build sustainable, profitable value chains where, with time, purely commercial rationale informs all of this. But and I think productivity is a key part of it. Productivity, of course, is a complex thing to define what the key drivers are, because in some instances it may be inadequate or inappropriate technology, so you've got to upgrade. In other cases, it's a skills gap which limits the unit output per person. In other instances, it's workplace organization and so on. So there's no question about it that productivity, efficiency, competitiveness, industrial dynamism must be some key things that we promote. But productivity is both a cause and a consequence. The more productive you are, the greater the success in securing localization, the more retailers and others would want to buy from you. But the flip side is also true. The more people buy from you and the greater the scale of production, the lower the unit costs, the greater the opportunity to get fresh investment, because there is a larger and a more predictable market. So what we've done is there are a few elements to the program in the recovery plan the President announced. One of it is localization, but by no means the only one. A second and quite significant one, which I've not dealt with centrally yet today, but it's a big part of our work, is the African Continental Free Trade Area. And big picture, there's 1.2 billion additional consumers elsewhere on the continent, increasingly urbanizing, increasingly or larger growing number of middle-class consumers, more disposable income, and as people leave subsistence economies to the market economy, they buy a lot more that they ordinarily would have produced in villages and for self-use. So there's an enormous opportunity there. And I now chair the African Ministers of Trade. We've been working really hard over the last few months to put in place the modalities so that by December, in a few weeks' time, at a meeting that we would want President Ramaphosa to host with other heads of state, we can announce a switch-on date for the start of trading and the products that will be covered in that. I came this morning from a signing ceremony with a state visit from the head of state from Malawi that visited South Africa. And in the course of that discussion, we just looked at what more could be done to open up the Malawian market to South African products. Now, Malawi on its own is quite a small market. And we import about 6 billion rands worth of goods. We export about 6 billion rands worth of goods to Malawi, and we import about 1 billion rands worth of goods. But if you add up each of the 54 countries that make up the African Union, that's an enormous quantity of goods. Something of the order of 7 trillion rands worth of goods are bought by African countries, excluding South Africa, from other parts of the world. So excluding any intra-African trade, just what we buy from Asia, Europe, the Americas, and Australia, that amounts to about 7 trillion rands worth of goods. Now, you know, if you think about it, that is many multiples the size of our manufacturing and agricultural sectors. So there are huge opportunities there. We don't even have to fully localize. We just need to get a fair slice of that for local manufacturers to be able to make an enormous difference. So moving to the question by Jean-Claude from Saint-Gobain, Africa. Yes, I think I've covered the export thing, but while we are going to be working hard on the free trade area, we see the significant advantage to be lower tariffs and simplified trading arrangements rather than direct cash incentives. You would have heard the news from Minister Mboweni. He's a tough colleague, and he, in his medium-term budget policy statement, he identified the fiscal challenges that we're facing, that we need a period where we can consolidate and ensure that our finances are stable and that we can avoid the enormous debt servicing costs that are just sapping so much of our taxes, your taxes. And so launching major new incentives is really not what we're looking at. It's reducing tariffs and easing the flow of goods across borders. And the World Bank did a study recently that put a cost, a value to that, and it's enormous. The stimulation and the economic multiplier that will come from the free trade area. Jean-Claude, you talked about the advertising campaign, and Eustace has shared a little bit from Proudly South African. But I would want to make an appeal that this should not become solely a Proudly South African campaign. That Proudly South Africa can do really valuable things, but we need to get local companies in your advertising budgets. If you can work with your marketing people to insert a message about why buying local can be helpful and good for the economy, that it will be creating local jobs. And, you know, if Nando's put out one and it's got a, fantastic humor that we've expected from Nando's over the years, it will be different to Toyota putting out one where they use the advertising handles that you associate with Toyota to be able to sell cars. But if we can get corporates to take this Proudly South African buy local campaign, give it their own flavor and twist and touch and feel, it would really be, I think, a great thing to do. And then finally, Jean-Claude, you raised the issue of state procurement. Now we have a very significant program of buying products locally. Last time I counted, there were more than 50 products and sub-products that we had designated. And so that gives us the legal framework to be able to require public entities to buy local. The challenge now is to ensure that this legal framework is complied with, that Transnet, Eskom, municipalities, provinces and others actually do procure locally. And we've had a very interesting example in the clothing and textile industry, where the parties got together and they now run a database where they track and monitor all public procurement. And they can tell me where the state is slipping up in not buying textile products from local manufacturers, whether it's army boots or police uniforms or the linen used in hospitals and so on. And it allows us then at national level to pinpoint the problem is with a hospital in the Eastern Cape. The problem is with a police tender that went out 6 months ago, and fix those problems. Because as you roll out new policies and new arrangements, there isn't always the full buy-in in the public sector. And so it's really being consistent and really pushing that envelope strongly that's going to make the big change. But Jean-Claude, much as the state has an enormous role to play, because we are a big procurer in the South African economy, I think it was Stavros who said that for pharmaceuticals, and I dare say it would be even more the case with most other products, that the real action is in the private sector, that procurement in the private sector accounts for the vast bulk of spending in the South African economy. And if we can get, together with the efforts of the state, a greater level of localization by the private sector, it would make an enormous difference. Someone asked the question around clothing and textile incentives, I think, and film incentives. Obviously, my department now has to deal with the challenges that in the context of budget cuts as a result of the pandemic and the need for us to shift money to healthcare facilities and to all the other issues that were required, were to take money and make available social grants and provide support for smaller businesses to survive this period. We've had to ensure that we don't overcommit on the incentive side. So there's been slowdowns. I know that there's been a strong lobby, for example, from the film side. Anand and others have raised this with us. But the team, I think, needs a bit of time to ensure that we know the final amount of money that we still have available. So take clothing and textiles. Historically, and I guess it's probably been going now maybe for about 6-7 years, we've been putting close to R1 billion a year into recapitalizing the sector through a competitiveness enhancement program where companies essentially buy new machinery or boilers and other equipment. And I've been to a number of factories where I've seen the company and the workers proudly show off their new machines and how it's improved the performance of those companies. Last year, from April last year to the end of March this year, we had disbursed just over R500 million, about 582 million rand in the clothing and textile sector. And in this financial year that we're in now, our financial years run from April to March the following year. We've disbursed about 200 million rand. So there is, in fact, a fair degree of traction, but we do expect this year that it will be lower than it was in the past, given the challenges that I have outlined. Similarly, on film, I think we've been able to turn South Africa into a significant location for filmmaking, but we sit with the reality that we need to see how we can sparingly use the available budget, which is lower than it was before. And so I can understand that there would be some arm wrestling between the sector desks and the sectors to see what's possible and what's not possible in this period. And I think it's for this reason, had there been more traction, more opportunity for the state to use public resources, there would have been still an argument for partnership, because I think partnership brings a lot more than resources. But the argument is stronger today because it's in your and our interests that we don't spend as much public resources given the fiscal circumstances that the country faces. So in these circumstances, just like 6 months ago, principally government was trying to ensure that in the early flush of the pandemic, that we put a relatively tough regulatory regime in place with level 5 and level 4, to some extent level 3. And now we've shifted much more of the responsibility onto consumers and businesses, and we've been able to open up a lot more. You saw what the president announced on tourism, for example, this week, and all of these will have a positive effect, but they need to be complemented now equally. While the state was able to put a lot more into incentives in the past, we now need to get a lot more activity and action, both in partnership, but critically by the private sector. And I must say, when I referred to it in my introductory remarks, when I spoke to CEOs of large players in the economy, I was struck by what was clearly, in a number of cases, real and deep commitment to localize. And they were offering us opportunities and identifying things, and many of those were not based on needing anything from the state, and certainly not in needing money from the state. Perhaps some steps to ensure that there would be a secure supply of agricultural inputs in the discussions we've had with Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola, by the way, is a really interesting example. I met with James Quincy, the global CEO, I guess it's about 5 years ago. And at the time, Coca-Cola had imported a fair quantity of the inputs that they use. And through the conversation and the discussion that was part of a competition settlement that enabled Coca-Cola to consolidate its operations, we reached a then groundbreaking agreement on localization. And I think Coca-Cola has got quite a bit of practical insights for those companies that want to learn the how to do it successfully. And I would suggest that, Martin, you may want to give Coca-Cola and some of the other players a platform in due course inside BUSA to be able to show how they did it and the advantage of it. Harold Harvey has already indicated when he started on the localization of these face masks, we were just completely uncompetitive in relation to Chinese suppliers. And scale brought efficiency and reduction in unit costs. And the world is replete with examples where if you can get scale, you can begin to do the things that addresses the efficiency challenge. Someone raised the issue on fragmentation of firms. When we did the big competition law reform 2 years ago, I addressed a meeting, a number of meetings with businesses before the act was finalized by Parliament. And I explained the rationale to business of the efforts to ensure a more inclusive economy, space and opportunity to bring young people, women-owned enterprises, Black industrialists, and so on into the economy, and why it was in all of our interests to create a more stable political environment so that you can see long-term return prospects, as opposed to a society in which those who are excluded constantly challenge the legitimacy of the system itself. And in the course of those discussions, I noted, and I put it in the government gazette when we put forward the framework, that big is not equal to bad, that in a global environment, and particularly with the African continental free trade area looming, South Africa needs global champions. You need firms with scale and size and muscle to be able to do the kind of things that, that is needed, to invest in R&D and innovation so that South African products remain cutting edge. I always like to quote the Hulaman example when I met with the Americans, with the, my trade counterpart in December last year, Ambassador Lighthizer. I said to him, you know, Ambassador, every time you get onto a plane and you want to keep your team and your president informed on your trade talks, and you fly with a Boeing across the world, nowadays you use your mobile phone, you WhatsApp and you email from the comfort of your plane seat. And one of the elements that goes into the Wi-Fi systems on Boeings is manufactured in South Africa at a local company called Hulaman. And we need many more examples, because a few swallows don't make a summer. And therefore, it's critical that firms have the size and the capability to invest in innovation. And so our competition law does not penalize large. It's not per se size. It's when there's either abuse of dominance, and the law spells out what is meant by dominance, or alternatively, when you have a single dominant player, and that dominant player essentially acts in a manner that has the outcome that the market is sewn up, that you don't have competition and you don't have new players entering. It's in those circumstances that the competition authorities can act. And I think it's a good thing. It's a part of creating a dynamic economy. But if our entire economy had to become just small and medium enterprises, then notwithstanding the example of Germany's very successful medium enterprise strategy, we would not be successful in achieving the kind of global impact that we need. We need large companies, but we need those large companies to ensure that they bring smaller suppliers and others into their supply chains, so that the economy also is an inclusive economy. Finally, Martin, no, two more. The one is, a question was asked on fit for purpose forums. And I guess what I'm seeking to do is to avoid these semi-standing committee task teams that will take 6 months to do what sensible people should really do over a coffee while maintaining the social distance. Something that can be done in an afternoon gets spun out. So it's really flexible modes, you know, a quick Zoom meeting with the example of dairy products. You know, somebody can just contact us. We'll give you the import data on dairy products. We'll break it down for you into the various issues. So if you like the example that I gave earlier around the edible oils, we can break that down for you into palm oils and soya and the other seeds and so on. And then really just move very quickly to set a work program up, get one or a few champions and move on implementation, and have a simple reporting framework that allows us to see, like any good dashboard, where we are. If we had to drive cars with the complexity of dashboards that we often design in meetings, I fear we'd spend all of our time simply looking at the dashboard and not being able to get the car started. A question was asked by Temi Tope Iluyemi on timeframes and measures of success. I think we need to develop annual targets, learn from doing, see where we were over-optimistic about what could be done, see where our targets are just too modest, and keep on refining, in order to achieve the overall target of 20% of current imports that we need to localize. So once we have an aggregate target, it's really seeing in each product how far we can go. And I think instead of spending 6 months haggling over getting the number right, because there is no science that is completely compelling with these things. It is a target we chase. It is informed by evidence, but there is no formula that is absolutely accurate in all circumstances. Like much of life, we feel our way as we go through it, knowing broadly speaking where we want to get to, and then navigating the challenges as they come. As Anand will tell you, if you had to develop a detailed blueprint for every movie and plot the next 1.5 years of production, allocating day by day what needs to be done, then I suspect he would never get a movie done, because life throws unexpected problems to movie makers. And that's how you produce pretty much anything. You problem solve as you go along, and you try to deal with the challenges as and when they come. What is the measure of success? Well, that's a simple one. It's that we increase the level of locally produced goods that go into intermediate production. So in other words, if it's premier food or pioneer food, what they procure, the percentage of their goods that are produced in South Africa, and then in the final users like your retailers and so on, the percentage of goods that they ultimately are able to sell, locally made goods that they're able to sell through marketing and so on to consumers. Another way of looking at it, which is available on a rapid basis, and it has checks and balances in it, is the quantity of goods we import. Can we see the import level going down and imports as a proportion of GDP going down? It's a trite point that every $1 billion of imports is $1 billion of GDP foregone. And that's effectively the challenge, that if we can bring that $1 billion or 16 billion rand of goods to South Africa, then our GDP will rise by that quantity, and then the multiplier impact kicks in. Someone now has a job because they produce pens, they buy food, and so food workers have additional jobs, they pay rent or rates, and so the municipality gets an income. That's the economic multiplier, and that is very significant in manufacturing, if you recall the ratios that I gave from the IDC. So there's a significant economic multiplier we can get. But the simple question, I think, is the measures of success is the degree of localization and the corollary of that to some extent, although these things never work out absolutely perfectly because economies are dynamic, but the percentage of goods that we import. And so, Martin, I was not able to go through the new questions that were popping in while I was talking, but I hope I've covered enough of a sample of them. And if you ask me, because I can see we're coming to the end of the time that you had arranged for people to put in their diaries, if there's a big takeout, it's to move from a state-centric approach that is centered on what government procures, although we need to do more to buy local, point taken. What government gives us incentives, although I fight a hard battle to get as much of the budget allocated to my department to support industry programs, so point taken, to get as much of the attention away of what government must do on tariffs and so on, although there's always a role there, and we've been able, for example, in February this year, I had increased the tariffs on poultry quite significantly, and we now produce 1 million chickens a week extra in South Africa over this 7-8 months period. So you can see the immediate connection between these kind of things. The private sector came to the party. They put R500 million of 750 million rands worth of investment in. So that's 750 million rand. And they are on track now to put another relatively similar sum into upgrading their plant and equipment, because we've said a protectionist approach that locks South Africa in undynamic, uncompetitive industry is not a long-term solution. So you need the boost of localization, but you've got to concentrate on getting the competitive equation also right. And as I said, these are interrelated and dynamic relationships. Stavros spoke about pharmaceuticals, and I made the point about Johnson & Johnson. We worked in partnership there. They were able to get some little bit of support from the state, but they were also able to put in a lot of private capital. And that was a big driver to produce a world-class manufacturing capability in Port Elizabeth that can easily be repurposed now to be a vaccine producer. So I was saying we're moving away from the state-centric approach to one where an increasing amount of time, energy, and effort is required by the private sector, where the ball has been moved to you. And you've got to play the ball, because when you get that energy, that enterprise, that can-do mentality of the private sector going and focus on the task of localizing to a greater extent, I think we can see good things coming for the country and good things coming for industrialization and for economic growth. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. I think that you have summed up extremely effectively the objectives not only of this session, but also set out clearly the way forward. I would like to thank you and Harold, Eustace, and of course Stavros for their contributions. If I can just say that those questions that were not answered or we didn't have time to answer have been noted by our colleagues from the DTIC, from Proudly South Africa, and indeed from BUSA. The relevant contact point for businesses, of course, Olivier Serrao, the Director responsible for economic policy at BUSA. Minister, we are fully committed as business to promote, broaden, and deepen localization across the economy. You've set us, I think, some ambitious targets. We now need to break them down. The devil, of course, is always in the detail. We need to make sure that we can come to the party on an effective basis, but as you said, on a basis that is commercially viable and in the interests of the country at large. I do believe, and I hear very well what you say about having meetings for meeting's sake. We won't do that, but we will, and I've seen there are many people who want to engage. We will encourage engagement directly with the DTIC or indeed with BUSA, where there are specific areas for cooperation and engagement that have been sought across a variety of industries. And I would like to think that we can create an appropriate mechanism to report back to you. And indeed, I have to say, not just to you, but to the country at large, because of course, those are the commitments that have been made in the context of the NEDLAC discussions that were held and in the context of the reconstruction and recovery plan that the President has announced and that we're now starting to implement as a country. So if I can thank everybody for having participated, particularly the many people who called in, for the people who organized this, but most importantly, Minister, to you, the team and the other panelists. Wishing you all a good, relaxing, and hopefully healthy and safe weekend.
Thank you very much, Martin, and all support to the Buy Local campaign, made in South Africa and grown here. And I look forward to receiving these reports on a regular basis and to engage with the business community again soon. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.